Hello and welcome to this second US election special from Spectator TV. We're delighted so many of you, 83,000 at the last count and rising, turned into our first discussion of the US presidential race. Special thanks to those of you who gave us feedback and helpful comments. Please continue to do so. Now, if you like the Spectator's take on all things American, Spectator TV viewers can get 10% off a subscription to our US website and our beautiful monthly print edition. All you have to do is go to spectator.us/subscribe, enter the promo code TV. Not that hard to remember. We're even going to throw in a free whiskey tumbler when you subscribe. I mean, what more can we do? This week, we'll discuss the new battle for the Supreme Court, the role of cancel culture in this presidential election, as well as the intervention of those famed political experts, Harry and Meghan, a Santa Barbara couple who've added their 2 cents to this year's election. Now, to start, I'm delighted that we're joined by David A. Kaplan, author of The Most Dangerous Branch Inside the Supreme Court in the Age of Trump. Douglas Murray, associate editor of The Spectator and author of The Madness of Crowds, as well as The Spectator's Washington editor, Amber Athey, our economics correspondent, Kate Andrews, she's an American who got lost in London and ended up at Spectator headquarters, and The Spectator's US editor, Freddie Gray. Welcome to you all. Let's get going. Our first topic, of course, is the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We learned that this legendary American jurist and feminist heroine, she had died this week at the age of 87 after a long battle with cancer. The news instantly triggered a political firestorm as Democrats warned that Donald Trump would exploit her death to push through his nominee before the election and thus give the highest court in the land a strong majority of right-of-center justices. And Mr. Trump duly obliged by promising he would announce his nominee this weekend and adding that it would be a woman. The strong favorite is Amy Coney Barrett. She's a conservative Catholic. Given the almighty first that occurred over Mr. Trump's last Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, I'm pretty sure we can expect more of the same. Let's turn to our first guest, David A. Kaplan. David, I suspect this Supreme Court fight is going to turn pretty nasty pretty quickly.
It's a good bet, but I wouldn't be sure. I think it is entirely conceivable that Democrats wanting to keep the electoral focus on the pandemic, realizing they don't have the votes to block this nomination, I could imagine them standing down. You could even imagine a boycott of the committee hearings, as at least was suggested for the Kavanaugh hearings. Now, I don't think senators will ultimately want to give up free airtime, will give up the microphone, but I think it's possible. And of course, Biden has a real dilemma trying to figure out how much capital to expend on these hearings, which are presumably a lost cause, because every day spent discussing the Supreme Court is a day not spent discussing the pandemic, which is his strongest argument to win.
It's interesting that there may not be huge political mileage in this for the Democrats. They expended a lot of political capital way back trying to stop Kavanaugh becoming the Supreme Court justice. It didn't work. Are they worried that that may happen again then, that they can't stop it and they're just going to waste political capital in trying to do so?
Well, it's a different time. 2018 was not a presidential election year. And once the disclosures from Christine Blasey Ford came out, they thought they had a real chance to scuttle that nomination. And had Senator Susan Collins of Maine gone the other way, they would have killed that nomination. Assuming nothing comes out about this nominee, whether it's Judge Barrett or Judge Lagoa, they may decide with 5 weeks to go or 3 weeks to go, if the confirmation hearings begin in mid-October, they may decide we need to keep a laser focus on the pandemic and that issue, because taking the White House is the key prize.
Now, there's always an argument when a justice dies in a presidential year. And the argument is, should the sitting president make the attempt to make the nomination, or should they wait until the people have had their say in the election? The Republicans famously used their Senate majority to block Barack Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, claiming that people should be able to express themselves on the ballot. This is precisely the argument Democrats are using now. I mean, is this just politicians being hypocritical?
Well, that's redundant. So yeah, of course it is. The problem with the Republican response is that you can't have it both ways. They argued X in 2016, and they're arguing not X in 2020. The distinctions between, well, you know, in 2016 it was a Democratic president and a Republican Senate, whereas this time the Republicans control both, is ridiculous. It doesn't even survive the laugh test. The argument last time, the core of the argument was, in an election year, you wait until the election to give the people a say. Now, I thought the argument wasn't strong, because of course the people had their say when they elected Barack Obama in 2012. You served for president for 4 full years, not 3 years. So I didn't think much of the argument, and I don't think much of the argument now. I think if on a clean slate, the president has every right to make a nomination, you know, right up until the end of his term. The Senate has every right to vote either way. The problem is the hypocrisy, as you point out. You can't argue what you said in 2016 and then with a straight face argue otherwise now. The more honest argument, not that honesty is the coin of the realm in politics, is simply saying, we have the power. This is a power play. We're going to exercise our power. That at least is straightforward. The problem, of course, with power plays is that when Democrats raise the specter now of packing the court, should they retake the White House, and the Senate elicits howls and yelps from Republicans, court packing has precedent in American history, unlike what the Republicans did in 2016, and increasing the size of the court come 2021, which I think Democrats may well do, is entirely contemplated by the Constitution. It's been done, and when Republicans scream bloody murder, that this is counter to history and counter to what the Constitution requires, I hope nobody's listening.
David, I want to come back to that about what the Democrats could do if they win the White House and the Senate in November. But before I do, I mean, given that Ginsburg was such an iconic, popular figure in the Democrat Party, would it not for Mr. Biden galvanize his base if he was seen to make a big fight of trying to stop whoever Mr. Trump nominates?
Maybe. I'm not smart enough to say for sure what the politics are. Maybe it's galvanizing for the Democrats, and maybe it's galvanizing for the Republicans. And you could easily imagine that Trump makes his nomination, but does not ultimately want a vote before Election Day, because that might motivate on the fence Republicans and independents to come out on Election Day, in theory, to support the nominee. Now, that could backfire. If Trump loses, or Republicans lose the Senate on Election Day, it makes it a lot harder for a vote thereafter to confirm Trump's nominee to look anything other than unseemly. So there's a risk. But, you know, in 2016, we saw from polling that the Supreme Court was a more important issue for Republicans than Democrats, and about a quarter of Trump voters who otherwise were repulsed by him, his policies, and him personally, said because of the Supreme Court, they would vote for him. A certain percentage of Hillary Clinton supporters said the same thing, but Republican voters found the court to be often decisive in 2016. They got what they wanted in Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. Will Democrats feel similarly because it's Ginsburg, or because now it seems like Roe v. Wade is really on the line? Hard to tell. You could argue it either way.
The latest polls, though, suggest that this time round, the Democrats feel more strongly about the Supreme Court than the Republicans.
The little bit of polling we've seen since she died last Friday bear that out. But it's a snapshot. You may see differently in a week. You may see differently in a month. And anecdotally, I mean, we know, and I know from having reported on the court for decades, that ever since Roe v. Wade in 1973, the court has been galvanizing for the right. And Democrats and liberals have never quite came to grips with the fact that while Roe constitutionalized abortion and was a major victory in social policy, it helped to radicalize the Republicans of the United States. You can make the argument, you can't prove it, but you can make the argument, and I do in my book, that but for Roe v. Wade in 1973, we would never have gotten Ronald Reagan. That you might still have what were known as Rockefeller Republicans in the United States, what passes for moderates. But the party, largely with the support of previously uninvolved evangelicals, shifted that party to the right and helped elect Reagan in 1980, and ever since has helped rally the party around it's time to overturn Roe. They may get what they want, I think, with this nomination, but they should beware as well, because if abortion becomes entirely illegal in many states, you may see organizing on the part of the Democratic Party that we haven't seen in a generation.
David, stick with this. You raised some fascinating points. I want to bring in Kate first here. Kate, is there any possibility in your view that even with a conservative majority, Mr. Trump gets this person through? I think it would then be 6-3 on the court, conservative majority. Is there any possibility that the court could then overturn Roe v. Wade, which would make essentially abortion illegal in the United States?
It is possible. It's certainly a fear that the Democrats and any pro-life person will be thinking about, but I think it feeds into broader concerns about the political balance of the court and just how political it's become. Ruth Bader Ginsburg quite famously wasn't a fan of the Roe v. Wade ruling, that landmark Supreme Court case that made abortion a constitutional right, not because she was pro-life. Indeed, she was very pro-choice, but she thought that it was structured on a poor argument, structured on a woman's right to privacy, and she thought it should have been founded constitutionally in gender equality. So she knew that it was always on shaky ground. And I think what you could see, because Roe v. Wade and the abortion debate has become so political, as David says, there could be a meaningful attempt to overturn it. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was pointing this out over the years. But I think this goes far past Roe v. Wade. It just speaks to how entrenched American institutions are with this political agenda, right, left. It's all feeding in through the institutions now. And this mudslinging, I think, you see between Republicans and Democrats, and the hypocrisy on both sides, flipping arguments that they were making in 2016 to try to get their judge appointed, just shows how important this decision has become and how the constitutional decisions in the U.S. are very much determined by politics these days.
Amber, what do you make of, what are the politics of this? How does the politics, we're not going to have a battle for a Supreme Court nomination. It's outside America, it's quite hard to understand because courts in other democracies tend to be separate from the political system. In America, the courts, the federal courts, Supreme Court, the district courts, the appeal courts, they become highly political. This is a political battle. How does it play out in the election campaign?
Right. Well, as David mentioned, this is really rare to see a Supreme Court vacancy galvanize Democrats more so than Republicans. But the problem is once we get to these confirmation hearings, if the Democrats overplay their hand like they did with Kavanaugh, then we could see that flip entirely. I can't tell you how many Republicans and conservatives I've spoken to over the past 2 years who describe themselves as being radicalized by the allegations that were made against Kavanaugh, from the gang rape allegations to all of the other stuff dating back to college where he was accused of throwing ice at someone. If the Democrats come in and try to level similar bunk accusations against Amy Coney Barrett, maybe they won't be sexual assault, maybe they'll be something else from her teenage years. then that could be something that Republicans certainly carry into election day. The other calculation that Democrats have to make is how much are they going to go after Coney Barrett for her faith? She is, of course, a very faithful Catholic. Well, Joe Biden is also apparently a Catholic, although he doesn't follow a lot of the church's teachings. So if some of the loudest Democrats in the Senate are on the record accosting Amy Coney Barrett for the fact that she follows things like the church's teaching on abortion or on birth control, how is that going to reflect back on the fact that they've nominated someone who is supposedly Catholic? So we've already seen articles come out from places like Newsweek and Reuters accusing Amy Coney Barrett of being a part of a Catholic group that was the inspiration for The Handmaid's Tale. If they continue that, you can see a lot of Catholic voters in the Midwest start to think to themselves, maybe Joe Biden and the Democrats are not actually our champion.
Interesting point. Douglas, has it become in modern times that these battles over Supreme Court nominations, which can turn pretty nasty these days and are highly divisive in the States, do we now see this as part of the cultural wars of America?
Well, they certainly are, but they're not a new phenomenon. I think most observers would probably trace this back to 1987 and President Reagan's attempt to get Judge Robert Bork nominated to the Supreme Court. Anyone who's ever seen, and of course it's all on YouTube, like everything these days, anyone who's seen the hearings and what Senator Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy in particular, put Judge Bork through, can't help but recognize that this is a precursor to the type of culture war battles that are going on at the moment, where accusations are leveled about a person's character, which don't even particularly need to be backed up by any evidence. But as long as they are accused of the now very common heresies of the time, that's enough to get the person basically out, or at least smeared enough to not want to go forward. So I think this has been going on since 1987. I think that was a particular low point, and I think ever since then, it's been inevitable. These nominations, each time they come round, get as dirty as they do. So it is a terrible phenomenon, but it's not completely new.
Freddie, is it an advantage or a disadvantage to Mr. Trump that he's now got this Supreme Court nomination battle playing out during the election campaign?
Well, I think Trump will like it on one level in that it shakes things up, and he needs to shake things up if he's to catch Biden in the polls. And he likes to keep things, as he famously told someone about a real estate deal, nice and complicated. And this certainly does that. And I think, therefore, if he can use this nomination to create a sense of culture war, as happened with Kavanaugh, I think it could be very beneficial to him. However, there is a big negative for him, which is that a lot of independents are being persuaded by this Trumpist argument, which is, if you don't vote for me, if Biden gets in, the radical left are going to take over and they will utterly destroy America. And if you look at what's happening with the riots, it's quite a compelling argument. However, if they stack the court in a conservative direction, it could mean a lot of independents start to think, well, what can Biden do? There's a Supreme Court to check him and to prevent this sort of radical takeover that we're being warned of. So I think it's a very mixed bag for Trump. But as I say, his main instinct is he likes to stir up the culture wars. We're already seeing it so far. He's going to push ahead with it, and he's going to try and cause a real battle.
David, let me come back to you. It's not that long ago that you needed a supermajority to get your nomination through the Senate. You needed 60 out of 100 votes to get the nominee confirmed for the Supreme Court. It's now just a simple majority. Has that made the whole nomination process more ideological, more extreme, playing to the bases, playing to the extremes of the party, because you don't need to put together 60 votes that may involve some compromises?
Of course. When the filibuster required 60 votes and earlier 67 votes, you were forced to find somebody closer to the middle. If you only need 50 plus 1 and you're the party in control, you can pick somebody as radical as you like. Without relitigating, Robert Bork was a really smart guy, one of the best legal minds in America. He was not picked for that reason. It was a nice thing it was a nice attribute, but he was picked because of his radical views on constitutional law, which is entirely reasonable if you agree with those views. But apart from Teddy Kennedy's demagogy, apart from him going over the line, the brief against Bork in 1987 was largely on the merits. The irony, of course, is that Antonin Scalia the year before was every bit as conservative, but hadn't put it down in writing. There was a battle over the Chief Justice seat, so Scalia, waltzed on through almost unanimously. There is absolutely nothing wrong, in my view, with evaluating nominees based on their ideologies, based on how you think they're going to vote. The notion, and we'll hear it during the upcoming hearings, that somebody's qualified. They went to a fine law school, they clerked for a Supreme Court justice, they teach at a great law school, they work at a great law firm, that makes them qualified, utterly misses the point and is disingenuous. Of course, they're capable of doing the job, but that's not the sole criterion on which to judge. And when the president and the Federalist Society in this case, that organization of conservative law students and faculty members and lawyers, when they are picking somebody specifically for their ideology, a prediction of how they'll vote on abortion or Obamacare and a range of other social issues, then it's entirely reasonable for senators and activists to similarly evaluate a nominee on that basis. But I wanted to make a larger point, and particularly when you refer to the judicial tradition in other countries. I argued in my book in a way that infuriated liberals and conservatives. My own wife disagreed with half my book.
You must be wrong then.
Well, you're right. I mean, I argue that the largest problem of the Supreme Court of the last 50 years, that it is simply too involved in too many areas of American life, and the court would be better turning away cases because the justices control their own docket. They would be better off pointing across the street at the Capitol and saying, it's up to Congress, or pointing to state courts or state legislatures and say, it's up to you. Just because you're asked to get involved doesn't mean you should. And sometimes the best kind of judging is when you decide not to decide. And I argue in the book, they should have done that in the case of abortion, but they also should have done that in 2000 in Bush v. Gore, when the court stepped in to resolve a disputed presidential election. They should have done it for gun control, voting rights. They should have done it in a range of areas. And the benefit of that would reduce the importance of the court, and it would lower the temperature of confirmation hearings. The conservatives are ascendant now, so they like a powerful Supreme Court.
Yes.
They didn't 40 years ago.
Yes.
And, that's the problem. And I interviewed a majority of the justices for my book. It was on background. I can't tell you who they were, but when they would ask me at the beginning of a conversation, could you summarize what the point of your book is? And I would say, well, you guys are involved in too many things. I had one of the liberals and one of the conservatives each say to me with a smile, well, I half agree with you. That's the problem.
David, I've got one. We're overrunning on this, but it's been such an important topic this week. It's fascinating to hear you. Let me ask you one final question. Suppose Mr. Trump gets his 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court, but on election day, the Democrats win the White House and the Senate. What is the likelihood or the chances, in your view, of the Democrats then trying to stack the Supreme Court? There have been 9 members of the Supreme Court since 1869 and the post-Civil War era. It doesn't specify 9 in the Constitution. It can be changed. FDR in 1937, because the Supreme Court was blocking a lot of the New Deal legislation or the interpretation of it, looked at stacking it. It kind of backfired on him. He didn't go ahead with it, but the Supreme Court did change its behavior and look more kindly on a lot of that New Deal legislation. What are the chances that it could go to 15 members to give the Democrats a majority this time?
The court has changed its roster 7 times in American history, not since 1869, but 7 times. So the idea that increasing the size of the court is ahistorical or is trampling on the Constitution, as the White House spokeswoman said yesterday, is idiotic. It's just wrong. Does it politicize the court? Sure. So does blocking Merrick Garland's appointment in 2016. And so does what's going on now. And there's an argument to be made. You don't have to be a Nobel laureate in game theory to realize that sometimes the way you respond is tit for tat. You've got to respond to a bully by being a bully. Otherwise, you're a sucker. And I think the Democrats, who usually demonstrate that they are really bad at playing bad, they're just not as good at hardball as Republicans. I think there is a growing consensus that if they take control in 2021, they will attempt to pack the court. And I argued actually in a new version of my book that came out last year, that was finally what Democrats ought to do. I resisted that because I think it's bad for the court. It will eliminate any notion that the court is independent and neutral and rules on some basis different than what legislatures or the president does. So I think in the short term, it's destructive of the court's prestige. My hope would be that in 5 or 50 years, after the Republicans have counterpacked when they took power, and then perhaps the Democrats counterpack, and maybe you have a court, of 21 justices, who knows? You may eventually have to put Ryanair seats up on the bench. But my hope would be that in time, both sides would come to realize that disarmament is the way to go, and that maybe we need to depoliticize the court, and instead of looking for judges who will simply be proxies for the partisan views of presidents, maybe we look to find judges in another tradition, those who attempt to apply the law more neutrally and more independently. And you can find any number of justices in American history not that long ago who behave that way. Would that reform take place? I'm not sure, but I think the only chance of depoliticizing the court is for the Democrats in 2021 to respond in kind. My predictions are almost always wrong. I was right with Kavanaugh. I was right with Scalia 30 plus years ago. I've been wrong almost every other time, but I think court packing will happen.
David, that's fascinating. We shall see what happens. It does, of course, mean the Democrats have to win the White House and the Senate first. David A. Kaplan, author of The Most Dangerous Branch Inside the Supreme Court in the Age of Trump. Thank you for joining and sharing your insights with the audience of Spectator TV US election special. Cancel culture and the election. Now, in 2016, Mr. Trump won the presidency in no small part because he waged war on political correctness. There were lots of Americans, not just Republicans, they were dying to hear a candidate who spoke frankly, bluntly, even shockingly about the big issues of the day. And since Mr. Trump's election, the phrase cancel culture has emerged. It refers to the phenomenon of people being censored, banned, hounded off social media, out of their jobs for having expressed the, quote, wrong point of view. President Trump, in a big speech at Mount Rushmore and in his convention address, he took aim at cancel culture, not surprisingly, and his team seemed eager to make it a centerpiece of his campaign. It helps to energize the base. He's also banning federal agencies from teaching critical race theory. Yeah, I'm not sure what that is either. Douglas, let's come to you first. How big is cancel culture in the United States? Is it over-exaggerated by the right, or is it a growing phenomenon in American public life?
It's both of these things. There are people who exaggerate the extent to which a thing called cancel culture exists. And like a lot of other terms in our era, like fake news, they're both specific and too flabby to be used because people mean different things when they refer to them. On the one hand, cancel culture can refer to people who do get hounded out of their jobs for expressing a view on social media that may well be, for instance, perfectly mainstream, but an employer might decide that the attention isn't worth the fuss. Likewise, it's used to describe online campaigns against large corporations and much more, boycotts, all of this. So it's become a term which it envelops quite a number of ideas. I think that the thing in it which has caught on is something that people do recognize, And that is a general feeling that there are opinions that are totally mainstream, indeed on occasion majority opinions, that have become almost unexpressible in the political mainstream without coming under at least significant pressure. And it's that sense, a sense that's not new. Again, it's something that's been around for a while. You could claim that it's a version of political correctness gone not just mad, but political correctness with heavier weaponry. So it's not entirely new. It comes from a familiar idea, but that is generally that people fear that they can't express themselves about certain things. Now, in America, there's an added issue with this now, and that is the cancellation of history. It's not only happening in America, it's happening in Britain and elsewhere as well. But that is a sense that everything to do with American history is also at risk of alleged cancellation. And that's not such a crazy idea. The 1619 project, it was created by the New York Times as an ongoing project. It won a Pulitzer, which it actually said that it wanted to bring the idea, the understanding of how America was founded forward more than around a century and a half to the first time that slaves were brought into America from Africa. This week, that has itself been the subject of a massive culture war because the founders of the 1619 project were accused of cancelling part of their own founding documents and then were themselves pushing back against this. But the point is that it's a tussle that is going on about everything, not just in the present, but in the past. And there's a lot in it.
Are we seeing a phenomenon here whereas younger people come out of the campus, come out of university, move into jobs? Maybe this is what we saw at the New York Times, where there was a huge row there involving cancel culture, that they are bringing with them the culture, the cancel culture of the campus into the institutions where they now work. Is that what is happening?
Yes, there used to be a conservative critique, you might even say conservative joke about certain campuses and certain studies in campuses in the US in particular, which was that people went away to university and did sort of basically useless degrees. That is, they studied critical race theory, feminist dance, and queer theatre, for instance. And the conservative critique of this conservative joke used to be, well, they're going to find out the hard way. The market is going to assert itself. These people aren't going to have jobs to go to. And that turned out to be flat out wrong. The conservative joke wasn't very funny, and the conservative hope that gravity would assert itself didn't happen. These people had a lot of jobs to go to. They flooded through the HR departments of major corporations. Every corporation in the US is now desperately reaching out for people of this ilk who can fill their companies and tell them that they don't know anything very much and should educate themselves. So actually the joke is on everyone else. And it's real. I mean, the phrase you just used earlier, critical race theory, only a few years ago was a ghettoized concept in a small number of liberal universities in the US. And now we're in a situation where almost everyone on earth has to start contending with it, even if they can't understand it, because most people can't understand it because it actually doesn't make any sense on its own terms. But that's another discussion.
Amber, how does Mr. Trump play this to his advantage? Is it really mainstream? I mean, I know we're all obsessed with who's running the op-ed page of the New York Times and who runs it, whatever, but do real people really care? Can Mr. Trump make this a mainstream issue?
I think what Trump really taps into is this really basic tenet of Americanism, which is the extreme love of free speech. And what he's able to do, because of the fact that he's such a big celebrity and because he's made so much money, is that he's basically uncancelable. So he is able to speak his mind and never apologize for anything offensive he might say. And that's something that really appeals to a lot of people who feel like they have to keep their politics or their deepest, most innermost thoughts under wraps for fear of reprisal from their peers. Trump is not the only person who has the celebrity to be uncancelable. The other person is actually Kanye West, who, despite being a black man to don a MAGA hat against, so many other rappers in Hollywood and in the music industry, has still managed to have best-selling albums, even creating a gospel album that was remarkably successful. So people see them as really icons of just a basic sense of being an American.
Kate, this cancel culture business, doesn't it play into what was already a part of the culture wars in 2016, when there was all this talk of the coastal elites on the east and the west, and then the rest of America was flyover country. The cancelling is happening overwhelmingly among the coastal elites. That's the people who are arguing about it. And for those who live in the so-called flyover country, it just seems bizarre. So, and I guess in a way it does play to Mr. Trump's narrative of energizing his base for this election.
Yeah, I think you can argue in a strange way that cancel culture does help President Trump, because it reaffirms what his base already believes, which is that the other side doesn't want to debate and sees debate as a fundamentally disagreeable and bad thing. And they do have some evidence to back that up. You had the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi suggesting less than a month ago that Joe Biden should not debate President Trump because he, quote, belittles those kinds of debates. Now, where to even begin with that? The idea that the American people shouldn't hear from the American president, democratically elected president, in an election year, or that somehow people are going to be worse informed because they hear the people that they're going to go out and vote for speak and debate. You know, it's hard to add up. And I think that works for the president because it means people who don't like him, who find him deeply offensive and grotesque, often if they do, as Amber says, have a soft spot and really support free speech, end up defending him. They don't want to defend him. They don't like what he's saying, but they do believe in his right to say it. So I think a lot of his opponents will still have that caveat there. And of course, that helps the president. I also think a lot of these very extreme right-wing views, any sympathy towards fascism or white supremacy, are extremely marginal. I think for most of us, there's this guttural instinct that you just don't want to be in any way associated with those views. The fear, of course, is that cancel culture actually gives people with deeply unsavory views more of a platform, because it's quite easy to ignore people who have really gross views. But if you cancel them, you might turn them into a celebrity. You give them a lot of airtime, and then actually quite moderate people who support free speech might find them sympathizing with people who have much more extreme views. And I think that is one of the dangers of cancel culture. But to your point, Andrew, I do think it feeds in to the president's rhetoric about the other side and about his opponents. But of course, if you don't have the money and the celebrity status and the title of president, as Donald Trump does, and you are just a normal person getting canceled, that can ruin your life. So it's one thing to use it as an election tactic, but in real life, it's hugely painful.
Freddie, the number of cases of people being cancelled is growing. There have been some particularly egregious examples. One was the young liberal Democrat pollster who had the temerity to point out that polling in 1968 showed that the riots helped the Republicans, helped Nixon to get elected, not the Democrats, which seems a strange reason to cancel anybody, but he lost his job. These are individual cases. I thought Amber mentioned 1619, and that sounded to me as an example of what's happening in the cultural wars, even more important, I would suggest, than individuals being cancelled. It seems in the end the purpose of 1619 was to reframe all of American history around slavery. Now, there is no question in the study of American history, slavery has often been underplayed. But this was an attempt to put slavery at the center of American history, so much so that part of the articles argued that the whole American Revolution began because of slavery. They thought the Brits were going to abolish slavery, so therefore they better get rid of the Brits so they could protect slavery. So even the most seminal event in American history, the foundation of America, the end of it being 13 colonies and becoming the United States of America, was done to preserve slavery. That seems to me, for lots of Americans, to be really an argument that they would want to have and that they won't go along with, and more important than a few individuals being cancelled.
A good example of that is the fact that the New York Times, at one stage after the 1619 project got going, the New York Times had serious editorial discussions about whether every time they used the word America, they should put comma, a nation that was founded on slavery and white oppression, comma.
Really?
And this was seriously discussed as something that the New York Times would have to do every time they used the word America or the United States, which shows the extent to which this pathology has gripped a large part of the left and the center left in America. But getting away from the media, I would also say there's an interesting phenomenon, which one of our writers, Bridget Fatesi, has talked about a lot, which is micro-cancellations. And what she means by that is the number of voters in America who will have felt during a conversation with their family or in the office or perhaps with friends that something they think is no longer acceptable. And there's increasing fear among a lot of Americans about what they can say out loud in certain places. And that is something that can have a serious impact on elections. And I think we underestimate that at our peril. One thing we've done recently on Spectator US is we've looked at a lot of secret suburban Trump mums, we call them. And we did a piece from one of them saying, you know, I can't admit to liking Donald Trump in the social circles I move in because it's unacceptable. And then we had this huge flood of emails from secret suburban Trump mums saying, I'm one of these people too. And so I wonder whether this is a small indication of a much bigger phenomenon that will play itself out in November.
Okay, we shall see, and we will return to it as well. It certainly is a key part of the cultural wars in the United States. Now, this week, a couple living in Santa Barbara, California, made a video appearance for Time magazine from their $14 million home. They issued a special plea to Americans to vote in what they called the most important election of all time. We can see a bit of that now.
Every 4 years, we are told the same thing, that this is the most important election of our lifetime. But this one is. When we vote, our values are put into action and our voices are heard.
It's vital that we reject hate speech, misinformation, and online negativity.
Yes, it was Harry Windsor and his wife, Meghan, also known as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Of course, the last time British royalty tried to tell Americans what to do, it didn't really end that well. Maybe they'll have more success this time. Douglas, they didn't quite say vote for Joe Biden, but it was pretty obvious that's what they meant, was it not?
Yes, it was. It's very hard to think that the conclusion of their remarks could ever have ended, so vote Trump, or 4 more years. Yes, it's the whole way that it was framed was very much of the coastal progressive Democrat Netflixy zeitgeist, which believes that it's very obvious and that if you're a good person, it's obvious who you vote for because it's good versus bad. And it's not terribly surprising. I mean, sometimes, of course, when people say, we were just talking earlier about critical race theory and all this, sometimes people say, has this stuff really gone very far? And I would say this is the latest example. Yes, it's even got to the head of Harry Windsor. So it's got very far indeed.
There might not have been much to stop it getting into that head.
It's possible the barriers aren't all up, but I would just suggest that, you know, this stuff that they have imbibed is absolutely the same thing as is being imbibed by college students across the US. And the problem with it is, of course, is that it not only is it simplistic, it doesn't allow for any brooking of what is normal democratic discourse, which is that there are meaningful agreements, that your opponents have meaningful reasons of their own to believe things, and you should try to understand them. And it drops all of that. It says it's very obvious. It's straightforward, and therefore, if you were to vote for Trump, you would be doing something knowingly bad. And I'm not surprised, particularly that the Duchess of Sussex takes this view. This is clearly a political view she's had for a long time. It is rather surprising to see Prince Harry voicing it, as you say, not least because it's quite hard to see whether there's an audience for him saying that. Secondly, because he also sort of begs in the video for a rather piteous bit where he says, many people won't know that I've never had the right to vote, as if he was sort of living under a minuscule form of apartheid in Britain throughout his whole life, and that we have to pity his terrible straitened circumstances he's always lived in. But also just this very strange thing that they seem to think that this influencer position they've come to is one that very many people want. I'm not sure. Maybe they will. I wouldn't myself.
And of course, Harry did not have the right to vote in Britain because he's a member of the royal family. The royal family doesn't get to vote. He hasn't got a right to vote in America because he's not an American citizen. Yes, at least not so far. Amber, I'm working on the assumption that Americans, they hang on every word that they hear from Harry and Meghan.
Well, it's quite funny because you would think Meghan would understand how Americans view British royalty, but she really doesn't seem to. I would say the average American basically views them as a very classy version of a Hollywood celebrity. And one of the things that's most appealing to Americans about the royal family is that they really don't speak that much in public. They kind of just walk around and look really pretty. So the fact that Meghan and Harry are constantly lecturing them about politics really takes away that intrigue, that mystique that Americans do like about royals, and turns them into just your average celebrity that's coming out of Hollywood and trying to tell people how to think and how to vote. Obviously, that didn't turn out so well for Hillary Clinton in 2016, who had a number of really high-profile celebrity endorsements and actually mocked President Trump for the fact that there are so few conservative celebrities. So it really boggles the mind as to why Prince Harry and Meghan would think that this is a winning strategy.
What I do know, Kate, about Hollywood celebrity is that if you're a celebrity in Hollywood, but you're not in the entertainment business, you're not a celebrity for long. Because in Hollywood, that's all that matters. And they're not really in the entertainment business, despite the deal from Netflix. They may be a diminishing phenomenon as celebrities.
They may be, you're right, Andrew, but not by, they've certainly been trying to break into it. We'll see how successful they are. But to echo Amber's point, Harry and Meghan traded the service that they would have been performing in the UK for the British people and the public to Hollywood fame. And once you step into Hollywood fame, then you get the title celebrity, not royal. And we did not see celebrities have a huge impact in 2016 or even in 2018. I don't think they sway as many hearts and minds as they think they do. And actually, I think very often it can work against them and the party that they're endorsing, because I think your average Joe or Jane out there sees these celebrities usually in their beautiful back gardens of their multi-million-dollar homes, and they think to themselves, you don't exactly represent me. So I think oftentimes weighing in can actually have the adverse effect.
Well, we have the person with us on this special Spectator TV broadcast who's responsible for it all. That is Freddie Gray, the editor of Spectator USA. In its very first print edition, Spectator US put Meghan Markle on the cover with an article from one of our star writers, Rod Liddell, saying, pleading, please America, take her back, referring to Meghan. Well, clearly, Freddie Gray, the message was heard, and you are responsible for this happening. And maybe Americans now are beginning to wish that they hadn't taken her back.
Well, the only thing we can do is next time do a We're Sorry edition. Because
I'm sorry, are you?
We well, not that sorry, but I mean, not sorry enough to take her back. But it was quite funny. I spoke to an American friend today who said, I mean, this shows how Americans treat royals. I think we think Americans treat royals very seriously, but actually they regard them as a bit of a joke. I spoke to an American friend and he said, I really want to meet Harry and Meghan so that when I see them, I can say, I saw your video and it really inspired me to vote for Donald Trump. And, and I think that's how Americans see it. They see these silly people who know nothing about politics suddenly acting like they're Michelle and Barack Obama just because they've both got Netflix TV deals, and they're acting as though they're in a position to tell Americans what to think. And it's an uncomfortable position for them because Americans don't take too kindly to it, I don't think.
You used to be a fan of Meghan Markle, Kate, and so was I. I actually watched the royal wedding, which is not something I would normally do, because I rather like the idea of Meghan Markle and Harry Windsor getting together as a modernization of the monarchy. What went wrong?
Well, look, she was an opinionated woman who was willing to express those opinions with an American accent in the UK. So naturally, I had to give her the benefit of the doubt. But unfortunately, I think having to take that back seat, having to not be the most important royal, perhaps not always the one to be in the spotlight, may have proved slightly difficult, because it strikes me, for all the criticisms of being in the media here in the UK, once they've gone to first Canada and now Hollywood, they can't seem to get enough media attention, and certainly want to continue to put their opinions out there. But again, once you abandon the royal family and you find yourself a Hollywood celebrity, you're held up as a celebrity. And they don't have the best track record when it comes to politics over the past 5, 10, quite a few years, actually, quite a few years. Hard to think of the last time a celebrity really swayed the hearts and minds of the American people. Maybe Ronald Reagan, actually.
I'd just add to that, of course, there is one giant problem coming for the both of them, which is that the woke agenda that they have signed up to has a lot of things in its sights, but one of them is privilege. Most commonly heard when people say, check your privilege. And I do worry that there is going to come a day when somebody says to Prince Harry that he should check his privilege, and he won't have nearly enough time to do so.
But he can say he never was able to vote. So how can you call him privileged?
Disenfranchised.
If they're going to make videos like the one they've done and take a part in public life and debate, essentially in politics, which fights up to them, if they want to do that, but shouldn't they think of giving up the titles Duke and Duchess and just become like the rest of us? Douglas?
Yes, I think very much so. I think it's an extremely uncomfortable, in the long term, unsustainable position. And yes, and they have given up bits of their roles already. Currently, they seem to want the good bits without the boring bits, as they seem to them, the unglamorous bits. You know, the opening of hospitals, the opening of schools and church halls. So no, I think that it is an uncomfortable situation. And I think that most people just feel very sorry for Her Majesty the Queen. Because there was so much promise in Prince Harry. He seemed to have so much to give, and to have gone off to the West Coast and sold himself to Netflix is probably not the future that many people wished for him.
No, because we've been spending so much time talking about the crucial issue of Harry and Meghan. We haven't got time to do China, but we'll do that in subsequent editions of Spectator TV, US election special. Let me just get in the final 5 minutes or so, let me get just your update on where we are in the election campaign. Amber, let me come to you first. How do you read things so far? I look at the national poll. It's not moved that much. Mr. Biden is 7 or 8 points ahead. I look at the Real Clear Politics average in 6 battleground states. Mr. Biden's on average about 3.5% ahead. That hasn't changed that much recently either. What's happening?
Yeah, I did actually see a Washington Post poll this morning in Arizona and Florida that had Trump up 1 percentage point in Arizona, and I believe it was 3 or 4 in Florida. And Washington Post, of course, is not exactly friendly to the president, and I'm sure was not really oversampling Republicans. So it is a good sign for Trump. I think obviously the battleground states are the most important anyway, because that is where those last 20 to 30 electoral votes needed to secure the election are going to come from. And the fact that the polls are pretty narrow, even some of the more liberal pollsters only have Biden up by 4 or 5 percentage points in some of those states, is a really good sign for the president, considering that's pretty close to within the margin of error. And back in 2016, a lot of these polls ended up being disastrously wrong, and a lot of them do oversample Democrats. So I think the Trump campaign is probably feeling pretty good about where they are right now.
Kate, where do you see things at the moment? Not long to go. Just coming up to what, about 6 weeks to go?
Not long to go, and I agree that the polls are tightening in the battleground states is relatively good news for the president, but I also wouldn't want to overstate it. The most notable state for me is Pennsylvania. Real Clear Politics now has Biden up by roughly, I think, 3 or 4 percentage points. That, of course, is his home state, so he should be overperforming there. That would be a worrying sign. But we know that, broadly speaking, for not just the past few months, but for well over a year, those independent voters and a lot of women have been gravitating towards Joe Biden because they just see him as a bit of a break from what has been a really crazy 4 years. Love it or hate it, it has been an absolutely has been an absolute roller coaster of a time. And the promises that people perhaps thought they were sold, that Donald Trump might calm down a bit in office once he was elected, haven't panned out. So my suspicion is that Joe Biden's still feeling relatively comfortable. I do think, however, a lot can change next week when we go into that first presidential debate. Joe Biden has been struggling on the campaign trail, often not with his messaging really, but getting out his messaging and his communication. And I suspect that the president will be ready to go for a very feisty debate. Joe Biden's going to have to rise above that, but he's also going to have to match the president in terms of energy and tone and rigor. And I think that could be a bit of a challenge.
Douglas, how do you read it as things stand at the moment?
Like a lot of people, a few months ago, I wouldn't have given the president very much of a chance. And now I think he's got a very good one. That's principally because of the riots, the disturbances, the looting, and much more that's gone on in so many American cities in recent months. And what I see as being the growth of those people that are similar to the ones that Freddie referred to earlier, the people who wouldn't admit to anyone who they might be voting for, but will slip into the booth and regretfully or happily vote for the person they didn't tell anyone that they anticipated voting for. I think that is a very interesting phenomenon this year, as it was in 2016. And I just add one other thing, which is when it comes to the debates, I mean, I have a very strong feeling that we will know who has won this election within the first 10 minutes of the first debate. Joe Biden has given speeches in recent weeks, which show that he actually is much more limber and fitter than President Trump likes to pretend that his opponent is in the various rallies. A couple of nights ago at a rally, President Trump had great fun with the crowd, joking that Joe Biden can't follow the teleprompter and that Trump, doesn't even need a teleprompter. We'll see. If Biden actually does, in the first minutes of the debate, clearly look like the candidate he would have been certainly a few years ago, then I think most people will think that that is indeed a safe option to some extent. However, if Trump is able to shark around him in a manner similar to that in which he managed with Hillary Clinton in 2016, I think a lot of people will think that the person who the Democrats thought was their safe candidate was a false hope.
Freddie, I'll give the last word to you as our US editor. I'm struggling to see what has yet moved the dial through this month of September, which is when the campaign has really got going. The Woodward book, Rage on COVID, when he claimed that the president knew how serious it was, but he covered it up. That didn't really move the dial, because I think a lot of people accepted the president's explanation. 200,000 fatalities in America through COVID, a huge number. That hasn't yet moved the dial either. So does it come down to Cleveland next Tuesday night and the first presidential debate?
I think the debates will be important, but I think, as you point out, a lot of the stories that the media get very excited about don't make that much of a difference on the polls. But there are interesting things that the Biden campaign, and I think a lot of conservative and Trump supporting pundits are missing, that are favorable for Biden. And one is his performance in states that aren't the battleground states. So Georgia, for instance, is looking quite interesting for Biden now, which was unexpected. Arizona's looking in favor of Biden. So you could see Trump maybe winning a lot of these battleground states that are crucial, but slipping up in areas where he didn't in 2016. So that will be interesting. And I think that more broadly on the debates, I don't necessarily feel there's going to be this crunch moment. I suggested this last week, that there's going to be this crunch moment where Biden, unless he does something completely crazy, I think Biden will be seen as having had an okay debate. So I think Biden is looking stronger in the polls than I would have said 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Well, I don't think it matters what time zone you're in. If you're interested in American politics, you've got to be watching live that Cleveland debate. It's going to be show business, I would think. That's us for Spectator TV, this second US election special. Thanks to our guests, thanks to the home team, thanks for all of you for tuning in. Remember, if you want to hear more from Spectator journalists that we've had on this show, subscribe to the Spectator's extensive American coverage at spectator.us/subscribe. Enter that code TV and you'll even get a discount. Our next edition of the US election Spectator TV special will be next week. It'll follow the Cleveland debate, and we'll be bringing you up to speed on what happened there and what will happen after. But for now, thank you and goodbye.